Hey everyone, this is Matt from howtogardendesign.com. For today's video, I'm doing something a little bit different, and it's actually an accompaniment to an article that I'm writing at the moment, and it's all around designing gardens for the elderly or for people who are infirm or have mobility issues. And one thing I want to look at in particular is one of the ideas that I explore in the article, which is adding ramps to your backyard. Ramps make a lot of sense. Obviously, they're sometimes easier than stairs. Usually the only problem I find with them, and one that happens quite frequently, is people will add a ramp to increase their access to the backyard, but they often add it so that it looks a little bit like this, where it goes all the way along. And it's this huge, ugly kind of ramp and allows them to get down to the yard, but ultimately it ends up being a bit of an eyesore. And it's something that can be challenging later on if you want to try and sell the property because you've got this enormous ramp that isn't much use to anyone who doesn't have mobility issues. What I propose instead, and something we're going to look at now, is to actually break up the ramp across different parts of the yard. Yes, I know, I got that. And that's what we're going to look at now. So, this is my fake site. It's actually my parents' house back in Melbourne, and we're just going to pretend that they're getting old and infirm, and we're looking at trying to add some different pathways throughout their kind of garden. So that's kind of how we're going to explore this video, I think, and hopefully this setup works. It's the first time I'm using it, so we'll see how it goes. So the first thing that's probably the easiest thing to think about is when you want to try and increase mobility to the backyard, ramps are great. I'm not saying you can't use stairs. I think stairs are useful. One of the things with ramps is you want to have what they call a 1 to 15 gradient, roughly. So for every 1 unit you go up, be it a meter or a foot, you want to try and go 15 across, and that's the rough slope that you're getting. That work? Hey, there we go. So sometimes you can get down to about 12, 1 to 12, more or less. A little bit of a delay, sorry about the drawing. But anyway, any steeper than that, it becomes a bit challenging, particularly for people in wheelchairs or with strollers. So I think 1 to 15 is a good thing to go by. Now, on a yard like this, we've actually got quite a bit of room. We could potentially put in a 1 to 15 gradient. However, sometimes that's not an option. And if that's not an option, probably one of the best ways you can do it, and something I learned in the first landscape job that I worked in, that my director kind of decided or recommended, which I think is really good advice, is if you do have to include stairs, don't include a whole heap of stairs, like 8 or 10 stairs in a row, because it's extremely, man, this is hard to do at once, it's extremely intimidating. You're actually better off doing a small set of stairs, no more than say 4, or in that case 3, then a landing, and then another set of stairs. And the benefit of this is you can actually break up, this landing can be an entire part of your garden, and that's what we're going to look at today. Same thing with ramps. You don't need one giant long ramp to get down to the level of the garden. You can break it up in different sections. So, what does that mean for our little garden? Well, a lot of it depends on the activities that the elderly users are still going to do. One thing I recommend, particularly with a yard like this, which is quite large, is they don't have to access every area. For example, this whole section back here, if I was to redesign this garden, probably even moving up to these kind of areas, it's probably not necessary that they need to get down there to maintain the garden. This is quite a large yard, as I said. So I would look at creating a design that is nice to look at, pleasantly, aesthetic. However, I would hopefully rely on family and friends to do the maintenance once or twice a year, something good for the grandkids to come and do. If not that, put it in the budget to have maintenance come by once or twice a year just to keep things tidy and clean. If that's not the case, and you do want to try and access all of the yard, it's just going to be a bit more challenging. But anyway, let's just clean this up. Let's have a look at the first and probably the easiest way to break up ramps across your site. So if we're starting from our back door area here, I'm going to ignore the spot levels for the moment. We're just going to touch on those at the last one. Let's just pretend this is all ground level and you've basically got this one top area of the yard here. That's all relatively flat. You've then got basically a gradient that goes down, slopes down towards that direction. And then you've got another area of the yard that kind of goes along here. And again, this area of the yard, you can see in those spot levels, which we will include, does slope down as well. I've got here only about 80 centimeters, but it's actually quite a lot more than that. It could be a couple of meters down towards this way. So if we look at it in section, which is something I encourage you to draw, you've got the house. Let's just say that's the base level of the house. you've got your top area of your yard, which is more or less like that, slight slope. Then you've got a pretty substantial section that goes down. That's this middle bit here. And then it continues down at a slightly slower pace like that. So you can see there's quite a bit of distance we need to cover from the floor of the house all the way down to that kind of bottom area of the yard. Now, one thing I mentioned was, I guess, the first idea we're going to look at, and as I said, it does depend on what activities you want to include in the design. So let's pretend that my elderly parents like, sitting, entertaining outdoors, which they do, and I'm going to ignore a lot of the design process that I usually recommend. We're just going to plonk some different activities down, and then we're going to link them up and see how that works. So the first one is entertaining. Let's just pretend we'll put that here, right? It means you get some afternoon shade because west is this direction, so you've got whatever shade happens on this side. Nice thing in the summer. We're going to have an entertaining area there. Dad also wants a veggie patch, so we're going to put a veggie patch somewhere down here. Again, I'm just blocking out shapes at the moment, bubble diagrams. I'm not really thinking about how it actually all interacts yet. Maybe we want another nice sitting area potentially, which could be somewhere in this section. And then maybe we'll just do a random third one that's like more utility based. That's like a clothesline and things. That's roughly the shape of where things are at the moment, so we'll keep that pretty consistent. So, as I said, instead of doing one massive ramp, let's just change the color to make it a bit easier to look. Go a nice orange here. Instead of doing one giant ramp to get down here, what we can look at trying to do, well, in fact, you'd probably have to go even further because you'd also want to hit this bottom section. So what I think we can try and recommend is, there we go. We have one ramp, sort of, that takes us in some manner to here. Be it if it doubles back again, maybe we need it to, it doesn't really matter. The point is that we've got one little section that goes in this direction. We can then do something similar, be it a ramp or steps. Again, we can use steps, it's not a huge issue, where if we want to do switchbacks again to this little area here, or again, maybe we do a set of steps. As I said, steps aren't, the enemy necessarily. If we want to use steps, we want to use them in smaller batches so that we continue that way. And again, from here to here is actually not too bad. We could do some sort of ramp. Again, your design style will dictate how these ramps go. I don't recommend just drawing random shapes like I'm doing. I would actually think about how you are designing the spaces and how that naturally leads into the next one. So what are the needs of the space? So in this particular area, if this is like a viewing section where my parents can sit and relax, get a little bit of afternoon sun if they want it, there's not some bad views, good English there, there's some okay views looking out in that direction. So it's probably not a bad place to sit. Downside being that, if you want to sit there with some drinks, you've got to take them with you. So maybe they're better off going back up here. Doesn't matter, we're just exploring ideas at the moment. So again, depending on how that space is designed may impact how this particular path here was shaped, right? It could also be that if you've got some sort of planting or garden bed or whatever it is there, maybe you want a water feature. That might be nice. Whatever is there will also dictate how this kind of path plays out, but it doesn't really matter. The last thing we can then do is, this area is relatively flat, so again, we can just do another path that goes kind of straight up in this direction. And then we're kind of back to where we started again. So it's really a circuit, right? The downside of having a circuit, I think, is that if you're stuck down here for whatever reason in the veggie patch and you need to get back to the house quickly, you kind of have to just go the long way around, whatever that may be. However, I think this is the most popular, the easiest one to implement, and I think it can work in a lot of different gardens, particularly smaller gardens than this particular space. So let's have a look at the second idea. Okay, the second idea is probably a little more formal in its design aesthetic, and it's basically a spine where you go directly down into the yard. So again, choosing where the spine goes sort of depends on other elements within the design. So realistically, I could go straight down the middle here. I wouldn't necessarily do that in this instance simply because I don't think it fits the aesthetic or the design style. I think my parents' house is a brick house. We're in a fairly tree a lot of trees in this area, so I think it's much more of a natural native Australian style I would recommend. So that doesn't lend itself to formal straight lines. However, we're getting off track. The idea simply is that, again, if we have those same kind of areas, and I got rid of the other ones, but that doesn't matter, roughly there, roughly here, and a utility space kind of there, whatever, doesn't matter. The point is that the spine is a bit more direct from A to B, and then the whole idea is that we're branching off if needed to get to those little spots. We probably don't really need one here because this top area is mainly flat. But again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. In this instance, I think it would work quite well. You'd probably just want to have some steps in this middle section rather than have big ramps. If you wanted a ramp, again, you could probably switch back in this way if you needed to make it work. This is still quite a lot of earthwork that would need to be done, same as the last idea, but we're just exploring concepts at the moment. The benefit, I think, of this is that, again, it's slightly faster going from one section to another. So if, again, my mum or dad are sitting back here and they need it up in the house, basically get onto that highway and go all the way back up. And a spine doesn't necessarily, just give me a sec while I get rid of all this, spine doesn't necessarily have to be directly down the middle. I think this would work quite well if you had like a terrace kind of environment where maybe you've got it down one side in particular. Now that may not work as well. Here basically the path kind of continues from this space, so I'm not necessarily having a spine all the way down. It would be a little stranger because you're probably hitting these 2 points with that path, and then you've got other paths that go out to these sections here. Again, maybe this one you do less of the spine and you do like a little connecting section to here. So again, really depends on how you want to space things out, but I think, again, a spine, would be a fairly straightforward approach. Probably doesn't work as well here if you're stuck here because you have to go all the way around and back up, but it doesn't really matter. So that's kind of the second idea, is to have a spine that you can use, and that may be a bit more straightforward than having kind of a path or circuit through the garden. Now the third one, let's just change our color up here. Let's do it green. So the third idea is a little more work again, and it touches on these particular things here that I've got, which are these spot levels. So this back door area here is actually about 1.2 meters, or about 4 feet off the ground. And one thing that exists at the moment is just a deck. So the deck comes out about there. There's some steps that go down to this section, and then there's another little decking area there with some more steps. Really poorly drawn to scale. But this is actually, aside from having a few steps, like, it's actually quite a good layout for elderly users, because there's about 4 steps in this area and there's about 5 steps here. This idea leverages that and goes into a little bit more detail, and the concept is really, sometimes if you've just got too much of a fall, so if your fall there is too much for, say, a ramp, or it's even too many steps, if you've got 6 or 7 steps, it may actually pay to bring that ground level up a little bit. And then if you want, you can add your steps in, or you can include a small ramp or whatever it is. So that's the idea here. So again, I'll just change that color so it's a little bit easier to see. We'll go with purple. But the idea is that we could bring up either with a raised deck, in this instance would probably be to go, or you could actually look at having a raised, not a garden bed, probably a raised, whole ground plane kind of thing. So it might be something where we actually extend out this area and we bring it around like that. And then from here we have another set of steps that go down if needed. So basically the idea is that we're bringing that ground level up so that you've got your steps coming from behind that go down onto it. And then again, you've got another set of steps that go down like this. Now, again, this is potentially a little bit more expensive. There's only certain heights you can get to, both before you need engineering and even just a safety component, depending on how much soil you're packing into there. A deck, like I said, may be another option, but basically it's just about, can we actually change the ground plane and the ground level more than you suspect, is one way to think about it. And the nice thing about these kind of approaches is you can then incorporate other elements that you probably haven't thought of in other spaces. So a good example would be, one good thing for elderly people is to have seating. Makes sense, right? Moving around the garden. there's opportunities now if you're building a structure to incorporate elements of seating in different places, storage if you need it. You can build raised garden beds, which again are another really good idea for elderly users. Again, I'm getting into more of the activity spaces now, but fundamentally, if you're looking at building these kind of spaces, it may be expensive initially on the outlay. However, I think it would pay back in the long run, because one of the core things I haven't quite mentioned with this whole approach is that if I was potentially looking at buying one of these houses, later on, and I walk into the space, looking at a design like this doesn't immediately shout to me that it's designed for an old person or someone with mobility issues or the infirm. It just looks like a garden design, right? And there's lots of different little bits and pieces that make it useful to a much broader demographic than just the elderly. So rather than walking outside and seeing this enormous ramp that instantly tells me, okay, this is something that someone built just so their parents could, access the garden like they used to, this kind of idea to me is much more holistic, and it incorporates more of an idea of a big garden design. So look, that's it for now. Let me know what you think of this kind of video. I do enjoy kind of drawing little sketches and bits and pieces. We'll see how it goes. Do check out the article. It's just Google how to garden design, elderly garden design or garden design for the elderly, something like that. And that'll be going up in the next day or so. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you found it interesting. Give it a like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. And I will see you in the next one.